Good evening, everyone. Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this closing evening panel of our first day of the conference, Futuring Critical Theory, on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the Institute for Social Research, also known as EFS here in Frankfurt. My name is Martin Saar. I'm teaching philosophy at the Goethe University just outside this big window. And you know the formula. I'm introducing two people to you who need no introduction, but who get it anyway, because they, of course, are extremely meaningful guests for exactly that conversation we'll be having during this whole conference, but especially on this evening, which has the title 100 Years of Critical Theory, 100 Years of Solitude, in Solitude, question mark. And as you know, the two people we'll be in conversation with tonight are part of exactly that debate, what was specific about this institutional history and this theoretical history, and what future does this history have. Rahel Jaeggi, to my left, is, as all of you will know, professor of practical philosophy, legal and social philosophy at Humboldt University in Berlin. She was a long-time member of the philosophy department here in Frankfurt, where she also received her PhD and her habilitation. She has taught, among other places, at Yale University, Fudan in Shanghai, the New School for Social Research in New York, and she was a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton. Since 2018, she has been the director of the Center for Social Critique, formerly known as the Center for Humanities and Social Change in Berlin, which has become a major site for discussing critical theory today. She has been a long-standing ally and partner of the EFS, I would like to say, and starting this year, she has become a member of the advisory board. And of course, as all of you will know, she's one of the most prominent and most accomplished voices in the debate about what critical theory is, what it has been, and what it might be. And if you want to know more, check out the website www.criticaltheoryinberlin.de. Her numerous publications include an early book on Hannah Arendt, which not so many people know, but then what many people know, a widely discussed book on alienation, originally published in the series of the EFS a couple of years ago, reissued by Surkamp. And in recent years, and it has been alluded to a couple of times already, the book Capitalism, A Conversation in Critical Theory, co-authored with Nancy Fraser, and Critique of Forms of Life, and a forthcoming book on Fortschritt und Regression, Progress and Regression. So thank you very much, Rahel, for making the way from Berlin. Martin J., for him it also holds true. He doesn't need any introduction, but I'll give it. He's the Ehrman Professor of European History Emeritus at the University of California at Berkeley. From 2007 to 2016, he was the co-director of the designated emphasis in critical theory in Berkeley. He was a visiting professor at many, many universities, including the University of Delhi, Yonsei University in Seoul, and Cornell University. He received an honorary doctorate of human letters from Bard College Berlin, and he won several awards for his work, including the prestigious American Historical Association Award for Scholarly Distinction. And since the book, The Dialectical Imagination, A History of the Frankfurt School and the Institute of Social Research, 1923 to 1950, published in 1973, Martin J. is the historian extraordinaire of this tradition, as everyone knows. And the book is also a bestseller in German. This is the first or second Fisher paperback edition from the early 1980s. Other of his more recent publications include Reason After His Eclipse on Late Critical Theory from 2016, Splinters in Your Eyes, Frankfurt School Provocations, published with Verso in 2020, and his book Immanent Critiques, The Frankfurt School Under Pressure, is forthcoming from Verso this week or this month even. So as you can hear, this is an expert on every single substantial theoretical and institutional historical aspect of the topic at hand. So please welcome Martin J. We have something like 90 minutes, and I would like to have us a conversation on the panel among the three of us, mainly between the two of you, maybe for the first 2/3, maybe 50, 55 minutes, and then we'll have a round of discussion with the audience, maybe for half an hour or so. I will pose questions concerning first the EFS critical theory relation. Then I'll ask you about the relation of critical theory to other critical theories second. I would like to focus and dwell a little bit on the problem of immanent critique connected to the concept of contradiction, theoretical core concept of the tradition. And if we find the time, we will also try to look ahead into the future in and even beyond Frankfurt. So let us start with the first round addressed to both of you, and you can both of you choose and pick what you want to pick up on. We celebrate 100 years of an institutional history of a specific institute, many changing personnels and episodes. But how much sense does it make to identify the history of the institute with the history of critical theory? So your first book was, of course, addressing that already. Rahel has a take on this. And this is something that is in the air, and it's something like an assumption that if we talk about the institutional history and its theoretical developments, we also tell the tale and the history of critical theory. And this is, on the one hand, true. On the other hand, of course, false, because there were other sides, other people, other protagonists, other histories, also textual histories, histories of reception. But if we start there, how much sense does it make to identify the two trajectories and to pin critical theory, the theoretical project, to this institutional place? And this is the second question, do the both of you even care about the pre-Horkheimer era, which we are celebrating if we are celebrating 1923? And it was, as you know, Horkheimer only coming into office in 1931. And most of the texts we refer to as the foundational texts are Horkheimer's early texts, or in the case of traditional critical theory, even texts way into the 30s. So there has been a 10-year-old history of an institute that we identify with a tradition, but that we most of the times don't mention. Do you mind? Rahel?
I mean, I would always say, I mean, in introductory lectures to critical theory, when I would say, yeah, the institute has been founded in 1923, but this is not the beginning of critical theory. The beginning of critical theory is when Horkheimer takes over. And I think this is true and false at the same time. I mean, one thing is, of course, critical theory and the institute are not the same. Critical theory is at the same time younger and older than this founding moment. It is older because, I mean, I would say it starts with Marx and Hegel in some sense. And it's younger because, as I said, it only starts when, I mean, the specific character of a critical theory only began to emerge when Horkheimer took over. So, yeah, it's not the same, but at the same time, I would say institutions matter. And that it's actually the history of this very institution. And I mean, most of all, this institution in emigration that shows that you need institutions, you need those moments, you need resources, material resources, in order to make things work, in order to bring together a constellation of thinkers that then could do something like a critical theory. And maybe the last word, I always liked Albrecht Wellmer's remark, who said, the Frankfurt School is not a school. It is an association of people who are interested in a critical theory of society. So there's no headmaster. And I would also say there are no generations in this sense that a lot of people speak about. About whether we should care more about the I mean, as a good reader of Martin Jay's book, I would say, I mean, I remember you quoting someone who said it's an unimaginative Marxism during this first period. I'm not so sure about this. I still think there have been different voices, and I mean, after all, Horkheimer has been part of this group, and there have been voices who were interested in figuring out the foundations of a new Marxism and so on. But still, I don't actually see what there is. But Martin knows so much more about it. I'm handing over.
Thanks very much for the question, which has puzzled me for many, many years. And it seems to me that the names that we use to describe historical phenomena are often arbitrarily picked, but then reveal a great deal about what we're talking about. So in this case, there's the Institute of Social Research, there's critical theory, and there's the Frankfurt School, the three great, we might call them protagonists of this 100-year-old narrative. They overlap, but not precisely the same. And even the Institute for Social Research begins, we might say, with a complicated choice in terms of the name, because it was supposed to be, so Felix Weil thought initially, the Institute for Marxism. And then the decision was made, no, this is a bit too provocative, we want to be connected to the university, let's call it something more neutral. And then social research, there's apparently some predecessor, I think in Japan, which is a name that seems to be utterly without any political content. Now, this was a name that has been attacked as basically Tarnsprache, or a kind of Aesopian, let's say, neutral term that was hiding the fact that it really was on the deepest level a Marxist institute. And certainly right-wing critics today have picked this up. They've said, aha, this is part of the Frankfurt School's deceptive history. It seems to me the choice is very revealing. Social research is different from Marxist theory and different from Marxist praxis. It creates, we might call it, a triangulated relationship, which is part of the whole history of these past 100 years. The relationship between theory, Marxist or critical, between research, not positivist, but nonetheless taking seriously social science, and then finally some connection, increasingly attenuated, with political practice, all three in a kind of constellation. And it's important to recognize that the social research aspect of the early Frankfurt School, and this brings us back to the period even before Horkheimer's takeover, was in a way a check on the more, let's say, problematic aspects of Marxist theory alone. When Lukács in History and Class Consciousness says, if the theory is contradicted by the facts, umso schlimmer für die Tatsachen, so much the worse for the facts. The implication there is the theory trumps empirical research and trumps all types of questions that are somehow superficial. That the depth of what's going on beneath is more important than what's happening on the surface. The notion of a kind of ascribed class consciousness versus empirical class consciousness captures that. The Frankfurt School, the Institute, was founded with the idea of social research as a check on the arrogance of that kind of theory, that one had to really find some way to figure out what was going on in this world rather than assume that the theory knew it in advance. Now, this was never an easy relationship, and the theory always, in some ways, never felt comfortable with the empirical practice. Adorno, lots of discussions of this throughout his life. The authoritarian personality, the studies in prejudice, not quite the same as dialectic of enlightenment. We all know that. But nonetheless, that's, I think, a significant aspect of the whole history. Now, having said that, one of the other, I think, crucial dimensions of that early period, just to come back to that point, is that the Frankfurt School, the Institute, was founded in a period of what we might call apocalyptic hopes for the achievement of socialism. The other of capitalism was on the table in 1923. A successful revolution had occurred in the Soviet Union, or in Russia, it became the Soviet Union. Revolutions had occurred in Central Europe, not successful, but at least potentially foretelling a future still to come. There was a great expectation in the early Frankfurt School that they were talking about socialization as a process. They were talking about the possibility of not socialism in one country, but socialism throughout the world, that this was an apocalyptic moment. The crisis of capitalism would not simply mean the end of capitalism, but also the onset of something better, which was understood in, let's say vague but nonetheless meaningful terms as socialism or perhaps communism. 100 years later, that has faded. That the difference between 1923 and 2023, that the other of capitalism no longer has the same power that it did when the Institute first began. Now, this process, we might say, of becoming more skeptical of the possibility of the other of capitalism is already detectable in the very early years of the Institute. When Pollock goes to the Soviet Union in 1927 and comes back and sees that it's not quite working the way it's supposed to work. And by the 1930s, it's clear that the Frankfurt School has, and it's not yet named that, but the members of the central core of the group has distanced itself from any hopes that the Soviet Union would produce the revolution that they had thought was on the horizon in 1923. Now, this is not to say that there are no continuities. I mean, Felix Weil remained, for example, in connection with the Comintern well into the 1930s, but this is a major distinction between that period and today. And I could go on and on. I mean, the idea of the Frankfurt School, just to take that as a concept, the city is crucial, and yet, of course, the American experience is no less crucial. And so, in some ways, it tilts the balance away from North America. It focuses it here back when the Institute was refounded. The idea of a school, as Rahel has already said, is a very complicated notion. It suggests that it's basically somehow a kind of orthodoxy, that it's a school with an inherent master, Horkheimer, and later masters like Habermas, perhaps Axel Honneth, and that it has a kind of coherence. Here, too, if we know the history well enough, we see how much there were people in that school who were rather, let's say, belligerent and, let's say, anti-authoritarian members of the school who did not agree with any sort of uniform position. And the Frankfurt School's great strength, it seems to me, is that it tolerated this kind of dissensus. I mean, sometimes Horkheimer was a bit dictatorial, the phrase that was actually used in the founding document when he became the director, but not so dictatorial that some sort of dissensus, for example, Neumann, Behemoth, Walter Benjamin's work, which they never could quite figure out, all of the other figures, Neumann, I mentioned, but Kirchheimer and so forth, going in their own slightly different directions. Marcuse later, of course, quarreling over politics. So the school itself was a rather unruly school. And one has to take that metaphor with a grain of salt. And what's fascinating, of course, and this was something we'll talk about, I'm sure, later, is that in the internationalization, the globalization of critical theory, this notion of a coherent school is much under pressure. And critical theory has escaped from, we might say, its local designation. It's become deterritorialized. The theory has traveled, and to some extent this means dilution, but I would argue to a great extent it means enrichment. And I'm sure we'll come back to that later.
May I just add a comment? Because you said the 1920s, 30s were this moment of crisis and catastrophe. I think, I mean, if it does make sense to celebrate this 100 years anniversary, it might be the fact that we are in somehow the same situation in terms of crisis, maybe not in terms of alternatives to capitalism, who could easily be found, who are just at hand. But I mean, the sense, this momentum, the sense of a crisis, I think, is something that is very similar to this situation. And maybe even talking about whether to evoke or not to evoke those, I mean, these institutions and the moments. The Arbeitswoche, the Marxistische Arbeitswoche, that was organized here, I think somehow showed that there is a momentum and that a young generation can identify with maybe not all of this past, but with this kind of moment where people got together and wanted to make space for critical theory or for critical science and practice at the same time.
I would agree with that entirely, except for this distinction. Both moments are what we might call apocalyptic moments. You may remember Michel Levy's book on Redemption and Utopia, which described a moment in the immediate after-war period, after World War I, when a kind of messianic, often Jewish, but not necessarily entirely Jewish, hope permeated a materialist philosophy. And there are other figures like Ernst Bloch who come into play here. Apocalypse, in that sense, was not only interested, or let's say hopeful about destruction, that capitalism was on the verge of being somehow undermined by its own contradictions, being undermined by a newly awakened historical subject. In other words, the sense that apocalypse meant the end of an era. And what it also included was apocalypse, in the traditional religious sense, is a revelation of something new, an unveiling, a belief that what would follow would be redemptive, what would follow would be different enough. In the late 20th and early 21st century, apocalypse returned. It returned in many different forms, and we see it with attitudes towards climate change and so forth, but that redemptive moment of unveiling is far less, I would say, present. That today people are anxious about a world which may well collapse, but there are very few people who have the hopes that they had 100 years ago that something called, let's say, socialism, communism, whatever you want to name it, was imaginable and realizable. That this is in some ways a different kind of crisis from the crisis in 1923. And maybe that'll change, one hopes it will, but I think that's an accurate presentation of where we are today.
No, I think it's right. And if I just add this one historical point, we often think of 1923 of prefiguring 29, the big financial crisis, and then 33, the takeover of the Nazis. But one should also think that it's just 4 years after 1919. So German society has had its great failure and defeat in military terms and a real revolution and the abolishment of the monarchy, and so the sending away of the Kaiser. So this was also the breaking up of something, and we all know this myth, which is a commercial myth about the roaring 20s also in Germany, Babylon, Berlin, and all these kind of things. But there was something in the air of a modernization dynamic, which also, I think, took hold of these minds that thought themselves as philosophers, scientists, and political minds at the same time. And this was a new era breaking up. And this was also, I think, part of the energy that surrounded the founding of this institute, as it was surrounding, by the way, the founding of Frankfurt University, which is a decade older, but also, in a way, was a bourgeois and a non-feudal and non-traditional and non-clerical institution, which made quite a difference. Also, the high percentage of Jewish professors at Goethe University was an absolutely crucial, let's say, factor and condition for the thriving of the institute, in a way, next to the university. But let's go a little bit further. So this was the question of, let's say, localization, positionality of the institute in the early years. We touched a little bit the question of unity. And Rahel, of course, says, no school, no headmaster, no benches. But still, there's the building, there's an institutional continuity. But of course, this unity is porous or flexible, to say the least. But what about the coherence? So is there something like determining commitments, values, or methodologies that keeps the tradition now of critical theory attached to the institute together or not? And is there something for you in your own work, either as an intellectual historian of the tradition or as someone placing herself within the tradition, that would be the first answer to come up? So a set of core concepts, core values, or a certain conception of a politicized critical science or theory. And maybe it's a bundle of things.
Yeah. I don't know, I wouldn't deny that there's unity. It's just not the unity of a school, or maybe not. Getting to the question of, are there things that, I'm actually interested in figuring out how critical theory, Frankfurt School critical theory, is at the same time different from other critical theories, and also, it has a specific It makes a specific contribution, but at the same time, of course, there are overlaps. And if I would have to define core elements, I would say what comes to mind. I would say immanent critique is one of the core elements, a certain kind of an attachment to a negativism, various ways of negativism, one could say. There's also the attachment to a broad concept of emancipation, a concept of emancipation that is more than just getting rid of domination in a narrow sense. Including a qualitative, what Marcuse called the qualitative different way of life that people are aiming at. Also, the idea that there is something as reason in history, even if it only shows as unreason in a certain way. So I think that again, this is the negativism of it, that what they are and we are looking for is those various forms of unreason and crisis that give us, at the same time, give us a hint about how things could be. I mean, this idea that there's a potential in history or whatever, or that there are potentials in a society that are not fulfilled, not only promises, but also real and material potentials. And this means that there's also, they share with Marxism anti-utopianism of a certain kind.
I would add a third dimension. There's the institutional, there's the theoretical, there's also the personal dimension. That is to say, if you look at the relationship between Horkheimer and Pollock, there's a fairly recent book by Nicola Emery on their relationship, their friendship. It begins with an incredible sense of more than just normal friendship, that they are somehow creating a kind of prototypical relationship which will be a relationship that foreshadows, maybe this is a fantasy, but foreshadows a society of the future, a society of mutuality, a society really of brotherly love. Now this continues all the way through until their deaths. And they, of course, go at the end of their lives to Montagnola, living in two houses next to one another. Nicola Emery talks about this at great length. This was the core of a kind of personal connection that was there also with Fromm at the beginning until it broke, with Lowenthal to some extent. They had known each other a long time. With Benjamin less so, although Benjamin and Adorno had a close relationship. Neumann and Marcuse had a very close personal friendship. Lowenthal and Marcuse. So personal friendships played a very, very important role. They went through, of course, the same experience of exile. Not all went back, and it was quite clear there was a split when only a few went back. Not all agreed in 1968 to accept what the students were doing. So it's not as if it continued in every possible way, but this dimension of the, at least what we might call classical Frankfurt School is extremely important in any account of what separates them from a normal institution or even a normal theoretical position. So Horkheimer was very clear that the Zeitschrift at Sozialforschung was not to be an open journal. It was to represent the line of the institute, and it was something that was supposedly collectively created, but with his input. Now later, it'll be very interesting to see how friendship networks worked in subsequent generations. So obviously, we know Habermas had more difficulty with Horkheimer than Adorno, and yet in some ways there are continuities there as well. Honedt and Habermas, some quarrels, but nonetheless continuities. And many of the current figures who are still writing in the critical theory tradition were schooled in Frankfurt by many of these, we might call them masters along the way. So that aspect of it was part of the early history. And that, of course, will change. I mean, as the internationalization occurs, these kinds of personal networks will no longer play a role. But as a dimension of critical theory, this kind of utopian dimension of a personal island, the Île Heureuse was, in fact, precisely the term that the Earl of Horkheimer used, a happy island. This kind of fantasy of utopian alternative was going to be realized in this, institute. Now, whether it happened is something else, but at least that was, I think, part of the ruling fantasy that began the whole show.
I mean, it is interesting, again, reading your book and others, how many of them have known each other since school. I mean, it's not just like an academic network, but something that goes way deeper. And this is, I mean, really an interesting part of it. But I mean, otherwise, I would say it's not so different today. I mean, my son always complains and says, whenever I look at those conferences you attend, those are more or less the same people that we see at our dinner parties here. So, more or less, but still, I mean, personal friendships still play an important role, I would say.
Yeah, this is an interesting topic. I don't know if anyone wants to talk about his or her friends more. But no, there is something. I see the point. There is a web of friendships underlying a theoretical grid. But then, come on, when they internationalize the journal, they look for these collaborators on all the different continents and all the different disciplines. They're saying, can you advise who could collaborate, who could contribute, because he's an expert on this. So they were both. They were friends, but they were also technocrats, kind of.
Well, there's an
it's actually amazing how global they were from the very beginning, that they would even manage to move the institutes and to have colleagues in those other countries. I mean, that was before the internet was invented. And
so the Frankfurt School invented the internet.
Yeah, more or less.
This is for Twitter. Yeah. So, but let's go. Excuse me. Let's go back from the personal to the paradigmatic question. I always love this term that Hauke Brunkhorst is using in one of the titles of his essays about the Paradigmakern of kritische Theorie, the paradigmatic core. So Rahel says, it's a couple of things. It's a methodological orientation, it's an emancipatory intent, it's also a systematic kind of social theoretical stance. And if we look at it now from the opponents, so from what is critical theory in this looser sense differentiated? Because we should not forget, the first, most important methodological article by Horkheimer draws the line. He says, here is traditional theory, there is critical theory. Do we buy this, that there is something that is drawing these lines? And of course, traditional theory is positivism and bourgeois science. But within the fields of the other social theories, the other Marxisms, the other social theories from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, do we still hold on to the specificity of that theoretical tradition? Or is this also a sense of Besonderheit, particularity, that maybe we don't even share? I grew up with people teaching me critical theory in Frankfurt School thought and post-structuralism, postmodernism, which at the time in Frankfurt were demonized as the other of that tradition. And the same holds true for the quarrels between the different strands of Marxism, of which critical theory, Frankfurt type, was in the German context, in the discussions of the left, also one specific type, not to be confused and conflated with the others. And maybe these games of differentiation and Auszeichnung have lost their pertinence. Maybe not, Rahel.
I don't know, I mean, when it comes to the difference between a critical theory of society and other theories of society, one would say most other theories of society are not critical as such. I mean, there are a lot of theories of society around that are not critical. On the other side, there's a lot of social criticism that is not a theory of society, that doesn't need one, that doesn't want one, and so on. So I would say this specific, the idea that you can only have a critical theory as a critical theory of society, and that you need a social theory in order to understand, analyze, and criticize the society. I would think that this is something specific, and that a lot of other critical, even critical theories don't share this approach. And the other, I mean, like kernel is a lot of very fruitful critical theories don't share this this idea of reason or unreason in history. And I have to say, it's not so easy to share, but it is something that is very specific, this idea.
Because you were also part of, let's say, the theory wars in the 1980s and 90s, which for us only in a way was a prehistory of discussions we had in the university of the mid-90s.
Well, this is an enormously complex question because I think critical theory has always been a dynamic constellation of different elements. So it's never been coherent in an absolutely uniform, static way, partly because it takes history seriously. And because history is part of it, it has to change. It has to respond to different stimuli from without. It has to reflect on its own premises. It has to move. And it introduces new ideas from the outside, whether it's psychoanalysis or perhaps even Foucault or later post-structuralists who then enrich critical theory rather than simply considered outside a canonical boundary. So critical theory is, if it's going to have a second 100 years, it's going to continue to be open-ended and not, I would say, reified. It has to have that sense of openness. And as a result, there is always a threat that it becomes diluted, it becomes meaningless, that the term becomes too capacious. Now, in terms of what actually is done in terms of changing the world, that may not be so important. In other words, it's not great to keep the brand going if it doesn't help to alleviate suffering and end injustice. It doesn't matter if 100 years from now the Institute is still going strong unless that task has been somehow enabled. But one aspect of critical theory that I think does set it apart, which is very different perhaps from other theories, is that it's not merely a critique of society, but also a self-critique. It's a critique that says, wait a minute, who am I? What are my normative assumptions? How can I justify them? And I think, Habermas, Honet, Rainer Forst, all the figures post-Adorno who have spent a lot of time telling us that the earlier normative foundations were somehow not quite as well developed and defended as they might be, have a point. And what they argued against post-structuralism is that it was crypto-normativist. It didn't really do that kind of self-reflection. It had investments, it had prejudices, it had politics, but it didn't really do as much to justify, to defend, to make transparent what those premises or prejudices were. Now, it turned out that rapprochement was possible. So the theory wars of the 80s, 90s, whenever they stopped, made too much of a us versus them. In the United States, it was Frankfurters versus French fries. It always seemed a little bit exaggerated. And then we discovered that, no, Foucault really found critical theory quite interesting. And I had conversations with him to that effect when he was at Berkeley. Or the Derrida and Habermas, after the philosophical discourse of modernity, could in fact find common ground. And it was possible to overcome that sense of inflated difference and realize that it was possible to learn from those alternative theories. And now with gender, post-colonial, and other kinds of queer theory and so forth, which the Frankfurt School only hinted at, we find that there is an enrichment possible, and there are ways in which we have to move towards a kind of more capacious version of it, which takes into account what Habermas would call a learning process, which is part of that historical openness, that you can't remain with canonical texts. It can't be doctrinal. It can't be defending the old school. It has to be somehow a learning process, which involves also learning from mistakes. And I think critical theory has been better at that than some other traditions.
So it's the school of institutionalized self-critique? Self-critique?
Well, I think self-critique is something that happens when there is a sense that you haven't really been honest about your own prejudices. You haven't been honest about who you are and what privileges you might, have, and how, the Grand Hotel Abyss argument that somehow being above the fray may have its costs. And that, if, as Gramsci said, we're all intellectual, as Habermas said, in the process of enlightenment, we're all participants, we have to recognize that we too can learn rather than simply teach. So it's a school which is, also, I would say, a school in which the educators have to be educated. And that's, I think, critical theory at its best is open to that. We can argue which direction it should go and so on, but I think that's part of what makes it still powerful.
Yeah. I mean, I would say everyone is very happy and has to be happy that those theory wars are no longer so important. At the same time, I mean, and this is, I mean, I have two somehow contradicting takes on this. I think on the one hand, it is important not to defend some kind of shallow pluralism here, let's say. I mean, let all the flowers bloom and everything. We should not even discuss our theoretical and practical differences. This is something that, yeah, what I would call a shallow pluralism that leads to nothing. On the other hand, we are very well advised to take our clue not only from theory, but also from the streets, as a Roman would say, and see what has a practical political effect and what kind of social movements are around. And then, I mean, getting back to the theory wars, you will see that all of this, I mean, back and forth about the normative foundations and the idea that post-structuralism would lead into some kind of immoralism and so on. I mean, have a look at, like, critical theories of race, at theories of gender, at post-colonial theories. You will see that there's, I mean, there's a lot of impact that is far from having had the depoliticizing effects that in the 80s Habermas, for example, would have thought it has. So on the one hand, I would say, let's see what informs and what inspires people who address domination, alienation, exploitation, whatever. But then it's also important not to neglect that there are important theoretical differences. So I would say that it's important to stay with a certain kind of, I mean, those core elements of critical theory, most of all because they are an interesting alternative to other ways to criticize society. They are an interesting alternative to, let's say, left Rawlsianism or certain kinds of social critique who, I don't know, I mean, there is a lot of stuff around with whom I think we should ally, I mean, form alliances, but at the same time try to figure out the demanding, and it is actually demanding. I mean, when you start, you might have the same experience. When you teach critical theory classes, you will have a lot of students who are in this class because they want to start criticizing right away. Tell us what to do, tell us what to address, and so on. And then you start explaining what dialectics in Adorno and why he goes for a negative dialectics, and you go through all this stuff. And it is difficult to see why those issues are so important and why those methodological issues and those, but they are important. And it is an interesting theory who thinks that one has to rethink those very foundations in order to. And again, it's important to see that this is not a precondition for even starting to act. I'm also very much, a defender of the position that critical theorists should also be engaged politically, I mean, and see and have this kind of check, the reality check on the streets and see what's going on there and see how things contradict their theoretical assumptions. Maybe one should, in this respect, also sometimes just held things apart. I mean, you don't have to understand dialectics before you know what to do and what to, when to go on the streets and where to fight against certain things. At the same time, it is something that is very special to go through all these analyses.
Throughout the history of the Frankfurt School, the issue of the political deficit, the gap between radical theory and transformative praxis has always been a problematic issue. There's no question about that. They knew that, and they made the decision to retreat into what Habermas called the strategy of hibernation, in which the Flaschenpost were being sent out for some future generation. And then, of course, when '68 came, Adorno said, no, not yet. Marcuse said, well, perhaps now. After '68, it's clear there was a move back towards a greater gap. Now, it seems to me here, once again, the question is historical. In the 1920s, it was possible to think that being political meant being part of a vanguard party, part of being part of a revolutionary movement, part of being a maximalist when it came to not only capitalism, but bourgeois democracy. In the 1930s and 40s, the members of the school who were in exile learned that bourgeois democracy was not simply a facade. And there's I can't do it justice, but there's one of the aphorisms in Minimum Moralia where Adorno explicitly says it seemed to be only a very thin and very meaningless thing, but it was something, bourgeois democracy, that saved my life, or saved our lives. And after they came back, of course, to Germany, the idea of rebuilding a bourgeois democracy was on the agenda. And certainly Habermas has continued what we might call a radical deliberative democracy argument. Now, in the current apocalyptic moment, we see that bourgeois democracy, liberal democracy, is seriously in danger, not from some utopian left, but radical right authoritarianism. And so, in a way, politics, to be political, once again, is an issue. What does it mean to be political? And Hannah Arendt and others have, helped us to figure that out. But it's not so clear that the initial Marxist notion of the unity of radical theory and revolutionary practice will help us to close the gap anymore. And if you look at, the actual practice, I mean, Habermas in particular, Habermas as a philosopher has been engaged in political debates perhaps more than any philosopher in our lifetime. I mean, unbelievably active in taking a stand on real political issues, and still in his 10th decade is doing that. So this is a kind of example how the theory can, in fact, have at least some relationship to the public sphere, to politics, without being, part of a revolutionary movement.
Not now, but in a couple of minutes, I will ask you about, not recommendations, but visions for a future of practicing critical theory, not in general, but also here, in this institute that is celebrating its own history. Let's stick for a moment with the idea of immanence, immanent critique, connectedness to the society within which this critique holds. A conception extremely dear to Rahel, but also to you, because this seems one of the big issues that the tradition inherited from the Marxian and Hegelian past. That talking to and about a society that it itself wants to enable to reform itself and to address a critique towards a body that can take on the critique itself, so that you don't have to come up with external criteria, as we sometimes say, external values, not a lofty abstract notion of freedom or justice, but something like embedded, lived notions, values, criteria that you have to elucidate. Horkheimer is pretty clear on this in his text in the early 30s. In your writings, you seem to say this was a methodological conviction that has exhausted its productivity or its functionality. Rahel seems to say that's exactly what we have to do, and keep on criticizing immanently, and therefore not being the outsider expert who is the Aufklärer of someone who needs Aufklärung, but in a way being part of an immanent process of, let's say, mutual enlightenment and reforms. Would you like to speak to that?
Well, this recent collection of essays with various immanent critiques takes a much more generous, position on the power of immanent critique. It seems to me it's a very, once again, historically variable issue. At certain moments, certain cultures, polities, societies have within them palpable tensions. I wouldn't call them contradictions, as palpable tensions between what they purport to be ideologically, their self-presentation, and the actual practices in that society. And it's possible to say, well, the German Democratic Republic was not so democratic. No matter how we describe democracy, it really wasn't. And we might argue the same thing about other complex societies. Adorno, however, once argued, and Marcuse in his notion of one-dimensional society made the same claim, is that the gap between pretension and practice was narrowed, and it was no longer possible to pit one against the other, that somehow things had become smoothed over, that depth and surface, or surface, had somehow been collapsed in a bad way. And therefore, one had to resort, perhaps, to something more transcendent. And when he finishes Minimum Morality by saying we have to look at things from the point of view of redemption, I mean, this is a very, very
non-imminent,
let's say a gamble. He's raising the stakes to some religious notion that he never really justifies. I mean, I think it's deeply problematic. And it shows a kind of desperation. And later Frankfurt School figures like Habermas in particular will look at normativity not in terms of redemption, but a revised notion of rationality, which to some extent is transhistorical or quasi-transcendent and so forth. So I think the dialectic of in and out, of immanent and transcendent, is one that is historically variable and is never fully resolved in one direction or the other. And this is shown simply by the fact that every seemingly, let's say, coherent culture, society, polity, is itself fractured, is itself open to the outside, is itself somehow filled with not an ideological unity, but rather with, if you don't want to call them contradictions, at least tensions. And that this allows, let's say in liberal democracy, a tension between human rights on the one hand and democratic will formation on the other, which never gets fully resolved. So this is part of the, let's say, inevitable, imminent tension which exists, and yet carries us beyond because human rights is supposedly universal. So there's always that sense of the porousness of the whole, which allows something to sneak in that's more transcendent, whether or not it's utterly universal or transcendent in a more modest sense as something else. But I think that's part of what keeps the story going, keeps the normative power of being critical going.
And I just noticed that you cannot say the term contradiction without relativizing it. And you say contradictions or rather tensions, because this also seems to be part of a vocabulary that is in a way in danger of being doctrinaire, I guess. And this might be different in Rahel's case.
I mean, I would say that there, of course, I agree that there's this, like, going back and forth between more immanent, more transcendent, but then it depends on what you count as transcendent and as immanent. And I would say there are, of course, so many varieties of both at stake. And, for example, many varieties of what counts as immanent, what counts as finding the norms of critique being immanent in some social formation. I would actually go for the negativist one, the one that doesn't count on, let's say, positive values already present, but maybe hidden, maybe not actually realized, and so on. I would go for the crisis moment and for the actually contradiction moment, and I think this is one of the that has important consequences. If you look at a society and criticize a society because it is also somehow dysfunctional, as complicated the idea of the society being dysfunctional is, and this is something that we're going to discuss with respect to the new program again and so on. I mean, the very idea that societies are and can become dysfunctional has, of course, been enriched by the idea that in the very functionality of society, normativity is already embedded. There's no such thing as just pure functioning in societies, I would say. But still, the idea that it's not just bad, it's not just wrong in a certain way, it is dysfunctional, and this is part of what it means that our societies are also irrational. And this seems something that is part of the tradition and also part, talking about, we don't have to stick to the tradition, but something that is worth thinking about in a systematical fashion. And this also means that the very idea of a contradiction has to be reconstructed. There are certain, I do understand Martin's hesitation towards the idea of contradiction. One thing is, not everything might be due to contradictions. The other thing is that contradictions have, let's say, a constructive element. It's also, a question of who contradicts, who establishes a certain kind of contradiction. it is a question of how you conceive of the relation between, I mean, we have been talking about crisis and a crisis critique of society, but of course a crisis critique must lead or must turn into some kind of social conflict in order to become a real potential. So all these issues, like how do crisis and conflict can relate to each other, is a conflict. And there, again, I would say that it's an important difference to, there are social theories and social critiques around that would emphasize conflict as against the idea, the more objective idea of a crisis, and for very good reasons. And those are the debates that I think are still, we still need to have.
We'll come back to this. I think I'm pretty sure that people will jump on this in the discussion. But maybe to conclude our round here, is there something you see as a perspective for the next years, given that diagnosis of the past, the tradition, and its core elements? One thing we haven't really talked about is, the friendship thing touches it, but it's a different point, the interdisciplinarity and the idea that getting a hold of the social problems of the present also involves getting different perspectives from different academic disciplines and the perspectives of the social actors in a way together. And this is something I think all of us still see as one of the major energies emanating from the early Horkheimer program. Not that the Institute itself fulfilled it at all times, but this holds a promise of a kind of collaborative scientific practice that also seems in tension, not to say in contradiction, to contemporary academic working conditions. So it makes no sense for someone working in tandem with many other people in different disciplines. Only under certain conditions, and these conditions have to be constructed or produced. And one might say the EFS should be a place where one tries to construct these kind of conditions where real interdisciplinary collaborations are possible and viable. But this might be just one thing.
What do you mean by real interdisciplinary collaborations? Because in some sense, interdisciplinarity has become an, ideology. Even, the DFG, the funding, the German funding, the most important funding institutions. There's rarely one of those big formats that doesn't ask for interdisciplinarity. So it's not true that that this is not enforced, but it is very often a fake interdisciplinarity. And the question is, what kind of? I would think that interdisciplinarity is still needed, and we should work on establishing and re-establishing those bounds and those connections between the disciplines. But the interesting question is not whether or not being interdisciplinary, but how, and for what reason and how, not just to build up those like umbrella interdisciplinary institutions that in some sense don't really need to speak to each other, where the disciplines don't really need to speak to each other. And I think the first step here is, you ask for, the future of those institutions like the EFS. I think the first step is to identify those problems and the kind of questions that need to be asked in an interdisciplinary mode. In our earlier panel, Peter Wagner was talking about economy and capitalism, and I would say in order to come up with a rich and fruitful critical theory of the economy. This is, for example, something that is not very often done, and those are disciplines who are, whose connections are unstable, let's say. This is something where I would see that there's a real need for informing each other, sociology, philosophy, economy, and so on. So an old program.
Yeah, I would argue there are two positions on the either end of a spectrum which are both problematic. One, the idea that we could harmonize all the disciplines using a meta-theory to bring them together. Horkheimer maybe had the fantasy of doing that at the beginning. Helmut Dubiel and others have shown that it doesn't really last very long. And that, when Fromm is let go, it's clear that something is not working. The other position is the utter, what I would call, isolation of disciplines, as if they were not in conversation with each other, where They were in a silo, completely and totally, sovereign. And this seems to me equally problematic. So the real action, we might say, is in the complicated dialogue among disciplines, which, as Adorno argued in his essays in sociology and psychology, reflect the social totality itself, which is a negative totality rather than a fully integrated one. So there is a social level, Durkheim was right. There is a psychological level, Durkheim may have underestimated that, but they're not precisely and completely harmonizable. For example, when Habermas, at the end of Erkenntnis und Interesse, used psychoanalysis to talk about the emancipatory interests in society, he made the mistake of combining them prematurely, that the therapy for an individual could somehow be a model for the therapy for a society. And he ultimately gave that up. So I think what we have to do is maintain a tense and contestatory, but nonetheless dialogic relationship among disciplines, and also recognize that disciplines themselves are historical. So psychology peels off from philosophy, and anthropology and sociology may be at one point connected and then gain a certain autonomy. And it's possible for various disciplines to come together. So there is something about disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity which itself has to be criticized. And we can perhaps hope for some sort of meta-theory which will infuse all the disciplines. But philosophy today, certainly in the United States, Anglo-American philosophy, has no interest in doing that whatsoever. I mean, it became itself a kind of isolated discipline. So who will do that? Who will be the meta-critical theorist who will bring it all together? That's not so clear, nor is it likely because society remains fractured to a great extent. One final point. The idea, and this comes back to contradiction, that the goal is overcoming all contradictions. The goal is finding some sort of harmonious reconciliation. Itself needs to be criticized. Because we know there are examples of what Adorno called erpresste Versöhnung in the case of Lukács. And in Germany, when we think of an attempt to somehow harmonize and synchronize, the word that comes to mind is Gleichschaltung, which has a very, very, I would say, unpleasant resonance. So we have to somehow recognize that even in an emancipated society, society without as much suffering as is the case in ours, there may still be antagonisms, agonisms, pluralism in a good way. There may still be gaps, still be unreconcilable differences, and that may be a good thing. So we have to figure out what the good gaps, the good, let's say, differences will be, as opposed to the ones that are dysfunctional in some sense.
So a last round, and please one sentence answers. So viewed from non-Frankfurt place perspective, from Berlin and from Berkeley. Do you live in Berkeley as an emeritus? Yeah. So what's the relevance of this tiny little commercial town at the Rhine and its tradition? Or should we abandon this idea that this school tradition, loose web of theories, had at one point a center of gravity? And should we, let's say, provincialize Frankfurt?
I would say critical theory already has globalized, multiplied, has a lot of different voices and a lot of different institutions in which it takes place. But I mean, look at this room. I mean, why shouldn't one use this kind of mythical idea of a Frankfurt school in order to bring people together and to like infuse them with those? So I don't know. I think it's reality. It's just not possible that Frankfurt alone will be the center for the next 100 years. It's already it isn't, and it shouldn't be. We have, I think, the kind of deprovincializing critical theory, decolonizing critical theory has already led to a situation where so many other perspectives come in, and this is very fruitful. But at the same time, why not also Frankfurt?
I mean, I have a stake in all this because my career has been made on, doing a lot with the Frankfurt School, so I don't want to see it dissolve. And when I came here in 1969 for the first time, the Frankfurt School was not an international phenomenon. It wasn't known in the United States. Adorno and company were not translated. Marcuse, yes, but the rest of it, no. And so in these 50 years, it's really an enormous success story. You think of all the other Western Marxists, you wouldn't get a room filled with Althusserians today. It wouldn't happen. So, well, I don't know any in the United States. I literally don't know anybody who is a serious Althusserian. I mean, maybe, there are people like Badiou and Rancière come out of that tradition, Balaban move against it. In any event, I mean, just to simply say this has been an incredibly important intellectual formation, which, as the next 100 years will, I'm sure, take it in new directions, as all traveling theories, it'll be watered down, it'll be, somehow, let's say, eclectically married to other traditions. But there's something about at least the charismatic early figures who, even though, broadly speaking, there's been a routinization of their work, and the Institute hasn't always maintained that charismatic aura, nonetheless, they still have something to teach us. And I'm amazed by the new, I mean, I've been studying this stuff for a long time. I learn all the time by reading the people who have discovered new materials, who have new insights. It's a tradition that, doesn't repeat itself. Even by going back to the original figures, you discover new things, new attitudes, new insights. So I would say it's still going to be going on for a while with the label, with the brand being intact. Now, 100 years from now, other people will be sitting here, they'll laugh at that. But I think that's the way it looks to me.
Okay, thank you. And the next days, of course, will be dedicated to exactly these questions about futures and future perspectives. So thank you very much, the two of you on the panel. And since we started a little bit later than in the program, we have 25 minutes or so for discussion. So if anyone wants to raise questions, perspective, contradictions, you are extremely welcome to do that. There's a micro that's being passed around. We'll take maybe two together from the start. Yes, you might start.
I have a quick question, a short question about the women. I want to know about the students like Angela Davis, but also Regina Becker-Schmidt, Helge Proos, Elisabeth Lenk, and Gretel Adorno. What was their role in critical theory and their importance? Because, for instance, in the research on authority and family, they still conceived the family as a sphere protected from capitalism. And this appears in many moments of Adorno's work. So I think a feminist could have helped a little bit in this aspect.
And Christina Lippert?
Just a very quick remark to this.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was great. I really enjoyed the conversation. I have a question for Rahel, like going back to something you said earlier in response to Martin's question of what distinguishes critical theory with capital letters from other critical theories. And you said what distinguishes it is that it is a critical theory of society, and that other critical theories, critical theory of society, and that other critical theories are not critical theories of society. And I think a lot depends, obviously, on what you mean by society here. And I think on the one hand, it's just like a clarificatory question, because I would really be interested in hearing more about that, because I was a bit puzzled by the claim that other critical theories without capital letters would not sort of, target society. But I guess on the other hand, there is a worry in the background, and I think it's a worry that has been raised by John Holmwood in the earlier panel 1, whether the focus on, or a certain conception of society as a kind of totality or whatever is in the background, I mean, that's what I'm asking for, what is in the background, is also what kept critical theory and what still keeps critical theory with capital letters from engaging with, for instance, the global history and consequences of empire and all the sort of questions of colonialism and its legacy. And so, yeah, I guess I would just like to hear more about what you meant when you said it's a critical theory of society. What do you mean by society?
Rahel?
But, I mean, to the first question, I think, because you mentioned Gretchen Adorno, and you might know much more about, the story behind it, but I always find it, take the dialectic of enlightenment. In one sense, I would defend the dialectic of enlightenment as a work of, a critique of masculinity, one of the first, profound critiques of masculinity, because this is about the dialectic of the emergence of the autonomous subject, but the autonomous subject is clearly described as the male subject and all of its problems and the hardship and the kind of, the disastrous consequences of it. It is somehow, so in some way it's a critique of masculinity, in some way you could see, in a lot of different aspects, you could, for example, see a theory of relational autonomy as we have it in some feminist theories. Avant la lettre, you can see it as, as I said, it's just a critique of what this male autonomous subject has to do to itself in order then to be disastrous towards its environment. On the other hand, as you probably know, in the introduction of the foreword of the dialectic of enlightenment, there is this little remark, Gretchen Adorno hat im allerschönsten Sinne geholfen. And whenever I read this, I get like, this is just, I don't know, in the most beautiful way. So Gretchen Adorno has helped in the most beautiful way. Gretel Adorno. Right. So Gretel Adorno has helped in the most beautiful way. And then you imagine her taking notes. So much about women in critical theory, and as again, you know, this has changed only very late, during the 70s, I would say. So there is a problem, but maybe one should distinguish between the resources that might be even in Minima Moralia, and Minima Moralia is full of, nasty chauvinism, male chauvinism, and at the same time there are a lot of analysis that might help us to understand and to decipher gender relations.
You want to talk about the female history?
It's always a very pressing issue, obviously, because it's clear, with the exception of Maria Hoda or Herta Herzog, who played a subordinate role, they never really elevated women to a significant position. And there were people, I helped a while ago with a dissertation by a woman named Stacy von Buchmann, who discovered as much as she could about Gretel Adorno. And Gretel Adorno was quite an extraordinary woman. She had a great friendship with Walter Benjamin. We have their letters. She was clearly devoted to her husband, but in a way that certainly was more than just a normal helpmate. Maidan Horkheimer, somewhat more passive. In other words, same thing with Lily Krakauer. You could look at the women's roles as fairly traditional. Gretel Adorno, of course, as I'm sure you know, was so devoted to her husband that after he died, she attempted to commit suicide, failed to do it, lived for a long time. It was an awful, awful story. And the role of the wives, Inga Neumann, there are others who became Inga Marcuse. They're very interesting stories. Leo Löwenthal's 3 wives, I knew the last 2 very well. These were very powerful figures, but in the actual constitution of the personnel and in the theory, a lot needed to be done that we would now feel has finally been added on. But when Horkheimer said, for example, that the pill was a mistake because it destroyed the family and moved women. This was something that showed how much they still had to learn. The same thing, of course, with heteronormativity. If you look at their attitude towards homosexuality, still, not as awful as some other people during this period, but problematic enough. So, once again, no reason to canonize, no reason to make them into figures whose historicity is to be forgotten. They were prisoners, as we all are, of their own times, and we now feel at least that we could, improve upon that in this and many other dimensions.
So Rahel, I think a few keywords suffice for Christina, what your notion of society is.
Critical theories and social theory. I mean, I had a very broad idea of, critical theories in the plural here in mind. I mean, famously, Michael Walzer, in one of the famous events here at the Institute, said that social criticism does not need a social theory. I mean, explicitly referring to, what the elder critical theorists would have said. Famously or obviously purely normative theories do not need a social theory. Why would they need it? I'm not saying that they don't have to contribute, or that Walz's kind of social criticism or the purely normative theory does not contribute to critical theory in this plural sense. But I think, again, one of the Markenkerne of critical theory is the strong connection to social theory. And then the question of totality, do I have a concept of totality? I think it is the question that is, I would defend some version of, let's say, emergent totalities, or totality from below, or trying to figure out how things hang together, influence each other, are functional for each other, and so on, and then try to get to a broader picture. So, but I think to confront the idea of totality has been something that was important for critical theory, and we, I think, cannot easily avoid it.
Then we have Sarah Speck and Rainer Forst.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, but I have to come back to the former point, as of course you know, Martin, and to the question of Bruna de la Torre, right? Because I think, and I'm happy to announce that at the Institute we are actually working on a history, or another historiography of the Institute regarding to women and women's intellectual work in the Institute, which is yet its history to be written. Because of course, when we talk about the history of the Institute or the history of critical theory, it is a history of men, of white men, and there have been not only the wives, but from the very beginning, intellectual contributions of women in different research projects. From the very beginning, from the foundation, it was 7 women taking part at the Marxistische Arbeitswoche. They were egalitarian participants of the whole discussion. And then in the research projects at the very beginning, we have Käthe Leichter, a very prominent, important figure. We have Hilde Weiss, we have later on, of course, Else Frankel-Brunswick, etc. And afterwards, in the 50s, we have Regina Becker-Schmidt and Helge Pross. And we have in the 70s, the Institute was one of the institutions in Germany which lay the foundation for feminist and women's studies in Germany. So there's a complete different history to tell about women in critical theory and in the Institute for Social Research, which you can probably read in the next month.
This is a great conversation, and before you all agree on everything, let me zero in on one disagreement that you have and dramatize it a bit. Looking at the title, 100 Years of Solitude, I think, and this goes in the direction of Martin J., and is a bit critical of the way you asked the question, Martin, and the way Rahel responded to immanent critique. We should remind ourselves that this version of theory was developed at a point at which in this country National Socialism was the regime that had a huge a huge support, popular support behind it. In that situation, developing critique could not be imminent. It had to face the fact that neither bourgeois values, nor if you went back to the tradition of German idealism as they did, the notion of rationality gave you sufficient grounds to identify the perversions and the irrationality of that regime. The dialectic of enlightenment is not just an Ausrutscher. It takes account of that, of the need to be critical of the standards that had been used for immanent critique. Now, that leads to a Hausaufgabe, which I think all generations have been laboring on, all further people in that tradition, because Rahel doesn't like the talk about generations, and I think for good reasons. Now, Horkheimer and Martin writes this in the Reason After Its Eclipse, tried to reconstruct a theory of rationality, but could only work with a theory of reason that was outmoded. So the negative dialectic is another attempt to think of what rationality would mean if you don't succumb to identity thinking. Habermas's Erkenntnis und Interesse went a transcendental route. The theory of communicative action to Axel Honneth in the struggle for recognition worked with an anthropological standpoint. So I'm just saying the drama of that version of critical theory is that you were not sure which standards of critique you could trust, you could rely on, and that sets into motion that movement of self-critique that I think we are still part of, and I think you too, Rahel, because the rationality of problem solving needs to be explained with a theory of rationality that has to transcend the given, at least the given as a material given, not the given as a formal given.
I don't actually see the, I mean, I do see the controversy, and I do see, I mean, I think that one should not take immanent critique as some kind of communitarianism, as you sometimes do. So immanent critique is not relying on the values that are already at stake and hold in a certain society. Immanent critique, and you're absolutely right, they started in this situation where it was social unreason and regression that ruled, and not some kind of, oh, there are those, this and that positive moment and potential. But this is not what immanent critique is about. So, but this is, I mean, a long-standing disagreement between us, I would say, with respect to rationality. As I said, it's about reason in a very broad sense, taking its clue from the moments of unreason that we are confronted with in society. And this is a difference. The difference is whether you think that there's unreason and there might be some kind of reason, or there's a reason that this refers to in some, however, I mean, distracted way. But so the difference between us is not whether this is about reason or not. It's different. I mean, I think we have different understandings of immanent critique and dialectic and so on. And this has a lot to do with whether you, I mean, in the end, whether you see Hegel as some kind of early communitarian or not, and I wouldn't.
Or as a theorist of ultimate reason.
I have no solution to this perennial problem. It's sort of Kant versus Hegel. There are lots of versions of this all throughout the history of critique, well before the Frankfurt School, whether or not it's grounded or whether or not it is somehow hovering above. And I think it's necessary because there's so much misery, oppression, suffering in the world to use every tool we possibly can to be critical. And so therefore, if we can find in the culture and the society something that will give us purchase through imminent analysis, take it. On the other hand, if it doesn't suffice, then we could recur to more transcendental notions, religious, say, or moral intuitions, or notions of rationality, or whatever seems to be a source of anguish and anger against the horrors that confront us. And I think that, therefore, the need for grounding is there for normativity as a kind of way to persuade other people. But the reality that hits us in the face is the injustice and suffering, and the fact that whatever the source of our indignation, we don't feel comfortable with it, and we need to act to change it.
So I had one last hand in the back, or in the middle, on the right.
Thanks. It goes quite along with the last question, and thanks for that question. Martin J., your book is called Dialectical Imagination. Imagination and a broader meaning of rationality was one core of the dialectic of enlightenment, and especially in the Adorno text. And do you think, and what do you think, both of you, is there a shift in this concept of rationality in the Frankfurt School and in the Frankfurt Institute? We had a panel this afternoon where there was also mentioned the danger of taking imagination as a solution for everything, which it cannot be. But in another way, do you also see a reduction? Because in my eyes, I in some ways see in some French tendencies of deconstruction a more open meaning of rationality, as I can find in contemporary critical theory.
Short answers, please, to this enormous question.
I would say that, again, there are resources for a broader concept of rationality, a dialectic of enlightenment, and the work of Adorno mostly, and of course Benjamin has a lot of resources. And I think it has something to do with the relation between the active and the passive moment here. And this is something that is also comes together in the notion of experience, a very broad and notion of experience that has something to do with letting the world infect you in some way. And I think this is very much at stake when it comes to imagination, when it comes to what does it mean to have a broad concept of rationality. And of course, again, critical theory has moved back and forth. Habermas has always been accused of having too narrow a concept of rationality. In some way, because he had this maybe ultra-narrow concept of rationality, he was then later on, and I mean his last work, it's not in some way it doesn't come as a surprise that he would look for those experiences and those articulations of, again, a rationality, Vernunft in a broader sense. At least this is how I would interpret his need to turn to what he did in his last work on religion. It has something to do with the insight, I would say, that you have to broaden the concept of rationality, or that experience is a deeper concept than something that is stuck to a certain idea of being in charge and active.
I mean, the issue of the relation between rationality and imagination is so enormous, I hesitate to even enter into a discussion, but I would make 2 points. One, the aesthetic is so crucial to the tradition, especially in the work of Benjamin and Adorno, and to some extent Horkheimer and Marcuse, means that the imagination is absolutely crucial, that reason by itself is insufficient, that there has to be some sort of source in fantasy and desire, in the way in which the aesthetic enriches our lives and creates a sense of dissatisfaction with them at the same time. But the other point is that the imagination has been colonized by the culture industry, so that the imagination is not quite as free as we hope it'll be, that the imagination can be directed for other purposes. And also, of course, we know there can be an evil imagination. I mean, the Nazis, God knows, had an imagination of what should be the case. And it's not one that was necessarily very healthy for the rest of the world. So imagination by itself, very powerful, but easily corruptible, easily connected in the wrong way to irrational and problematic, let's say, purposes. Very short answer, big question.
Okay, thank you. So. So we wish you all an imaginative evening, and I'll see you all at 9:30 tomorrow morning, Professor Gominda Gambra, on critical theory in a reparative mode. Thank you very much. Have a good night.